So in discussing this and giving you many examples, I want to be clear as I'm trying to illustrate an issue that some of those things aren't really what fantasy theme would be interested in, right? So we're interested in how people converge. But in all that, fantasy theme analysis is really not about, for instance, uh, true or historical meanings. So if you see the rainbow flag, which is a sign of gay pride, a sign for the queer community, you don't say, well, actually, that flag goes back to the French Revolution and the. No, that's not how it's being used in this context, right? So that's why we're not interested in the quote unquote true or historical meanings. It might be of interest to throw in there, but that's not what we're going to focus on. What we're going to focus on is how is that symbol being used at this moment, right? How is it being used in that particular artifact that we're looking at, right? We're not necessarily looking at cryptic symbols. The reading makes reference to cryptic symbols. They may or may not be cryptic. A friend of mine posted on Facebook the other day and said, "Can anybody tell me what this is?" And somebody had a decal on the side of their car, and it was the American flag, and where the field would be blue and where the stripes would be red, it was all just gray, and there's a little blue line down the middle of right of the flag, sort of horizontally. And somebody had to say, "Oh, it's the thin blue line. It's a sort of Blue Lives Matter, uh, police." Full respect for the police and right. It's like, oh, I get it, right? And then understanding that was part of, and I saw it too. I was like, oh yeah, that one I've seen before, right? And understanding that it's not merely about support your local police, which in of itself sounds fine. It's the idea that, or it's related to the ideas that against concerns about police over response, aggression, and violence, right? Violence by police, unnecessary violence by police. We could talk about what necessary violence is some other time, right? It's the idea that no, the police are the thin blue line between sort of the U.S. you have today and complete anarchy, right? That's what it refers to. It's not an entirely cryptic symbol, pretty easy to crack, but it's a symbol that may not mean something to people right away. So fantasy theme analysis isn't necessarily about cryptic symbols. And it's not about simple in jokes. It's not just about my wife saying, "Oh, please, 8 pound, 6 ounce newborn baby Jesus," right? That's not about simple in jokes. That's not really the focus of fantasy theme analysis, which I abbreviate FTA. Fantasy theme analysis is, however, about a shared vision. So it is much more interested in, if we talk about the rhetoric of the thin blue line or Blue Lives Matter, what is the vision of that, right? What is that vision? That's something that fantasy theme analysis is very interested in, right? A single bumper sticker, not so much. The bumper sticker and other things like that ties into a larger vision. That's something that fantasy theme analysis is very interested in. So general considerations as you go to do a fantasy theme analysis. So I ask here, is it live or is it Memorex? And you're like, I have no clue what you're talking about. Ah, so it's a cue to something you don't understand. Perhaps, you and I may not be sharing in the same sort of community and experience. Memorex produced a series or produced video cassettes and audio cassettes, but their campaign started with their audio cassettes. And the idea was that their quality of their audio cassettes was so good, you wouldn't know if you were hearing something live or if it was recorded on one of their tapes. So is it live or is it Memorex? The idea being they're both equally good. The point is, it's just a reference to something that you may not get. So, you know, it's a cue, right? It's a cue. We'll talk about cues in a moment. And so there are in life dramatic situations, right? You're in a store and somebody runs in and screams obscenities and grabs something off a shelf and goes running out the door. That's a very dramatic situation. But it's not anything we're going to talk about in fantasy theme analysis. Right? It's a dramatic situation. I'm interested in the dramatic communication. So a dramatic situation might also be George Floyd being, a knee pinned on his neck and him suffocating as people stood watching. Right. By the way, violence being threatened against them, there'd be pepper spray if they try to intervene, and so that's a dramatic situation. What we're interested in are the dramatized communication. How do we talk about that event, right? Because again, rhetoric is about how we talk about the event. How do we frame it? Do we frame it as an instance of somebody who clearly was resisting and police having to do a very tough job? Or do we talk about the excessive use of force, particularly aimed at Black bodies in our country? All right, so dramatized communication is what we look at in fantasy theme analysis. Right, and so we're looking at how the communication provides a compelling explanation, right, to the people in that community who are going to share in this vision. How is it a compelling explanation? Are the images and the actions, are they stereotypical or are they more complex? This is a bit like when we talk about flat and round and narrative, right? So is it stereotypical or is it complex? Those are things we're going to look at. And is there just a cue? You might have just a cue, you might not. Because in fact, you may have a speech elsewhere where someone in passing only mentions George Floyd, where they merely mention George Floyd, and you're supposed to understand the event and understand what horrific thing took place. There's an old song called, well, I don't know what it's called, but it says, "Has anybody here seen my old friend Martin?" That's what it says, Martin. Well, it's Martin Luther King. "Has anybody here seen my old friend Bobby?" It's Robert Kennedy, or Robert F. Kennedy, right? So it's those are just little cues, and you have to know what they tie into to share in this larger drama. In that case, that song is mourning the death of people who were struggling for civil rights in the 1960s. And so we get then to these principles of chains and visions. So chaining out, the book talks a little bit about this, about chaining out, and that is when a story, a fantasy, it takes root. And so we see it pop up and appear in many places. I mean, Harry Potter is a good example of the way it chains out. And so people just wearing shirts that say Gryffindor or Slytherin, or using those colors, or other jokes, references to butterbeer. I mean, which by the way sounds hideous, right? Not being a beer drinker myself, right? It takes root. It chains out, and it's all over the place. It's many places. It's popping up. It's like the way memes function, and certain memes chain out. Like there's that meme of the woman screaming opposite a cat just staring, right? There's a certain thing there about the hysterical woman and the hysterical white woman and the cat that does not care, right? There's certain sort of cultural conventions that are being relied upon there. Again, you have to sort of be familiar with certain discourses to be aware of, right? So chaining out is when a fantasy take roots and we see it spread out. We see it chains out, but it spreads. And so in all those places, again, all the Harry Potter merchandise that sometimes I look at something, I think, what is that? Oh, it's a Harry Potter thing. I don't recognize it as such, but my wife knows right away. And we want to talk about then whether or not, or consider, if a fantasy has actually formed a rhetorical vision. So a fantasy is the telling of a certain event, but a rhetorical vision is whether or not it becomes part of is it part of a larger discourse? Is it talked about in a way that fits in with the way that we have told other fantasies? You might think a little bit, for instance, about as a way of thinking about this. A fantasy could be, for instance, bear with me, uh, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Disney version of Cinderella, the Disney version of Sleeping Beauty, right? Which, by the way, I sort of have a sort of affection for Sleeping Beauty, but I can talk about some other time, but as its feminist potential. But anyway, so those would all be fantasies about uh, the young woman who is in some kind of trouble or in danger, and in all of her goodness and with good people around her or somebody helping her, her life ends happily ever after. Those are all fantasies. When we step back, we see, oh, it's not just Cinderella. It's also Snow White and the Sleeping Beauty, and I'm going to some old school Disney stuff here, right? But those would all be a rhetorical vision about young womanhood and persevering through hardships, and others there to care for them and save them to give them the life that's happily ever after. And by the way, in all cases, men carrying them off into a life that is happily ever after. That's a rhetorical vision. In your own analysis, you might just look at one show and it's a fantasy, and you can talk about how this fantasy, or there's certain fantasies within that show that participate in a larger rhetorical vision, right? A rhetorical vision about how children are the sine qua non. That's how you know you have a family. The sine qua non of a family is whether or not there are children, because that's what really makes a family. Or just the rhetorical vision that the children's well-being is central to the function of the family, and we all order ourselves around that. I mean, I think about when I look at a lot of the media for children as well as adolescents, how much of there's these, each one, there's these fantasies they're telling, but the way they all fit in this larger rhetorical vision in which kids have to solve the problems of the worlds themselves. I remember seeing the first Transformer movie. It's the only Transformer movie I've seen. I'm an old school Transformer, thank you very much. But seeing that, and so his car is turned into a robot, and he's not telling his parents, right? He's a teenager, but no, it's a problem to take on himself. There's a rhetorical vision we have here across all these media that teens are responsible for their own issues, their own problems. Parents are a hindrance, or they're ignorant or naive, right? Though they too were once teens, right? So we might talk about these fantasies and then mention the way it ties into a larger rhetorical vision. And again, the rhetorical vision we talk about as being, it's some sort of coherent composite of fantasies. Put all those fantasies together, and that total vision that you're getting. So a way of thinking of it is that coherent composite of fantasies, right? So the composite sketch, you interview 5 people to figure out what the motor look like, right? That's the composite. And this then forms a rhetorical community, right? All of those, all the people who are sort of, if you will, buying into these fantasies, embracing them, they form a certain rhetorical community. And that rhetorical community, again, can be based around issues of gender, of sexuality, of race and ethnicity, of politics, etc. But it's rhetorical vision, and the people who share that rhetorical vision, they're part of a rhetorical community. Now, your book also talks about the way that fantasy themes are important to social movements, and they are. They're really important to social movements. And the book talks about the life cycle of social movements, and social movements as being formal and informal. Right, that's fine. That's just sort of interesting. It's nothing that I do much with in this class. It's not really relevant. If it's useful to you to discuss it, go ahead. But you don't have to focus on fantasies that are tied to social movements necessarily. That's all fantasy themes and rhetorical visions are not necessarily tied to even an informal social movement. So if it's useful for you to talk about something as part of a social movement, you should definitely do that. But if it's not, just don't worry about it. It's okay.